Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with a short little video just to talk about the upcoming new Lizardmen units in the Silence and the Fury DLC. There's just a handful of them, of course, but they are big, they're monstrous, they're stompy, and well, we're here to talk about just what impact they might have on the meta, what sort of function they might have on the Lizardmen roster, how they might shake things up, as well as to discuss a little bit of how they might be useful in campaign and just whether or not they're even going to be worthwhile in campaign. First off, though, we will be kicking things off with Omiable, perhaps one of the more normal-ish units on this list, a legendary lord version of a chameleon skinks. Obviously, much like normal chameleon skinks, he does have a pretty beefy missile resist of 40%. Pretty terrible HP, but that is, of course, somewhat offset by the missile resist. Makes him resistant to, say, fireball sniping. With the armor, obviously, he's still going to take a nasty hit, probably a good 500 or so damage from an overcast fireball, but at least he is able to tank some of it there. Okay melee stats, but nothing to write home about. But he does get poison damage both on melee and range. He, in fact, does get magic damage at range, which is I wouldn't want to say rare, but it's not something you see all that often on Lizardmen. You don't have too many units with magic damage. And he does get AP damage on his missiles. His range is also quite a bit longer than chameleon skinks, or, for example, pistol characters like Luther Harkon or a Witch Hunter. He sits at a comfy 120 range, which allows him to kite short bow units, allows him to out skirmish a lot of shorter range skirmish cav, and when you activate one of his abilities here, Master Predator, he actually can match handgun units for range, though it does come at the cost of some speed. He does gain snipe, unspottable, and extra range, which is pretty nifty. Besides that, he does get the usual lineup of Lizardmen skills. Cold-Blooded, of course, is in there. He also does get Slippery, as well as the Golden Blowpipe of Tui, because, of course, GW has some of the best naming conventions when it comes to Lizardmen. Besides that, he does get Vanguard deployment, Firewall moving, of course, stock, 360 fire, the usual stuff you'd expect out of a chameleon skink, but all in a legendary lord package. And I think this guy actually has potential to be decent. He is fairly cheap, which is important, and he can apply just a constant stream of fire over the course of a game, much in the same vein of somebody like Marcus Wolfhard. I think it's entirely possible we'll often see Omiable come in basically butt naked, and not coming in even with the golden blowpipe or slippery or whatever. You just come in stripped down and look to just poke down enemies from afar, because over the course of a long game he does do about 300 damage per volley, and he's got 50 of those volleys, so that is a pretty hefty amount of damage that he can pump out. And again, if he's focusing a single entity, he can really basically kill any single entity given the time. His rate of fire is decent. It's not quite on par with the Skink Chief, so he doesn't actually fire quite that fast, but of course he has more projectiles, so the DPS is much higher. But AP damage, all that stuff. Basically, there's no target that's truly safe, and with such a cheap character, you've got a lot of money left over for a big army. And Lizardmen are not necessarily a faction that, you know, if you bring a big army, a lot of their units are pretty self-sufficient. A lot of them have fairly good leadership that you don't necessarily need a lord to be your hard carry. So if Omiable's in there popping shots, he can definitely do some decent slowpoke, in much the same way as I'd say a Marcus Wolfhard or even a Lithanar can do over the course of a lengthy game, or a Glady maybe or a Waystalker. Usually this is a sort of a perk you'll see with heroes, more so I think like Waystalkers or Witch Hunters, where you get this slowpoke over the course of a game where the unit's too annoying to shut down, but if you let them fire, they just rack up the hurt. And I think Omiable is definitely going to be in that sort of camp of units that, given the time, they're just going to be a pain in the rear and do insane amounts of damage. That said, of course, fairly squishy against direct damage. If you didn't bring either a Bastillodon with a Rev Crystal or a Skink Oracle, he's got no source of healing, so 2700 HP, not too impressive, pretty easy to melt down with Spear Leeches, Final Transmutations, if he happens to get caught by a fireball. While the fireball won't do as much damage because of the missile resist, it's still going to chunk him decently, so that's something to keep in mind. And in campaign, I don't think he's a particularly good lord. Now, as far as start position, I think it's fun. I think, obviously, the Lizardmen are just fine in campaign, so he's fine. Omiable ends up being a fine lord, but because his army can carry him. But I think as far as a sort of lord to have in a campaign, he's not really a lord you can super roid rage. He's not kind of crazy overpowered in and of himself. Missile characters in campaign just are not that great, except for like the sisters with their shotgun blast. So I don't think he's going to be that great in campaign, unfortunately, just due to the way the battles tend to pan out. But in multiplayer, I think he's going to have his niche. Next up here, we do have the Skink Oracle, and this bad boy is a new hero for the Lizardmen. He does come with a mixed lore of magic, and is always mounted on the fearsome Triglodon mount, and that is one of the big new beasties that was added in this DLC, and you can see the feral Triglodons down there. And the Skink Oracle, well, I think he's going to be a bit niche, but he does bring some interesting utility to the table, because he gives you kind of a unit that can cover a lot of bases. The Triglodon is designated anti-large, that is what it's designed to kill. It's got a bonus for large on its missiles. But it does have fairly good mobility. It is a mount that has poison damage in melee as well as in range. It does AP damage both in melee and range. It's kind of a budget Carnosaur when it comes to its melee stats. And you throw on some magic, and he's got a good variation of magic. You've got Earthblood, you do have Fireball, both of which are excellent spells. You also do have Flock of Doom, which isn't bad. Wind Blast, good for deleting small clumped up units. Harmonic Convergence, always an okay choice. And the new Wissen's Wild Form. For those who don't know, Lore of Beasts did get a whole bunch of buffs and changes, and perhaps we'll discuss those in an upcoming video. But one of them, Wissen's Wild Form, now does apply to AP damage, which makes it, for a faction like Lizardmen, who have a lot of AP causing units, a much more valuable ability. Before, it was kind of sucked. Because for Lizardmen, most of your units are doing AP, so extra non-AP damage, who cares? But now you do get 25% across the board, definitely a much stronger buff than before. He also does get the War Drum of Zahutek, which I don't think you're going to bother with in most cases, as well as the Opal Amulet, which can be pretty nifty to preserve this unit a little bit longer. Now, I will say, while this character does come with a lot of punch, he also does, I believe, attack separately from the Triglodon, and while it does consume ammunition at a faster pace, it does mean that the actual attack speed on the Skink Oracle here is a little bit faster than what you'd expect. But while he does come with this massive amount of utility and this massive amount of variety of things he can do, he is a fairly expensive character. Butt naked with no spells, in which case you're literally just looking at a basic, if we compare it here, the feral, at which point you're literally just looking at a feral Triglodon without Rampage and with leadership and cold-blooded. He costs 450 gold more, which is pretty insane. Start throwing on spells, and you're looking at a 23 to 2400 gold character, much more expensive than even the Regiment of Renown Feral Triglodon. So if you want just the Triglodon, this guy's definitely not a cheap way to go about it. Even if you factor in, I think, a Skink Priest, he's going to be, I think, a bit more expensive, though perhaps it would be worth it if you're bringing us, because you do get those extra different spells that a Skink Priest would not normally get, like Earthblood or Fireball. Otherwise, decent combatant. I definitely think he's going to have his niche, but I do think the cost is going to hold this guy back a little bit. I think it's going to make him not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's going to mean that in certain cases you're just not going to want to bring this guy, because you always have to bring him on a Triglodon, and you don't always want a Triglodon, especially not an overly expensive one. In campaign, I actually think I should mention, in campaign, I actually think Skink Oracles are pretty awesome. Granted, most of the Lizardmen heroes are pretty awesome, but Skink Oracles, you get magic, you get combat stats. So you get both skill lines, which is awesome. You're able to buff up both stat lines. And while his spell selection is perhaps not the best for campaign, you still do get that Earthblood, you still get Flock of Doom, which is all pretty solid. And the Triglodon itself is a fine beast in campaign. So it can cleave units with its ranged attacks. It's actually decent against infantry just because of the splash. So just a pretty fearsome unit. Definitely for my time, just playing around with them with Oxyal's campaign, these guys are really, really potent. Moving on to the Chameleon Stalkers, this is a unit, I've got to be honest with you guys, I'm not, at the moment at least, super impressed with. They do basically they've got the same HP lineup as Chameleon Skinks, or I shouldn't say it's not quite the same. They've got a bit less HP, but they've got a similar sort of design to Chameleon Skinks. You've got Stalk, you have missile resist and physical resist in their case, so you don't actually get the 40% missile resist. It's split with physical resist, so you're a little tankier in melee. You do also get high melee defense, and you do get this explosive short-range attack when you're closing in on a target. And that's the only time it activates, when you're charging into combat. Unfortunately, I don't really think these guys are particularly great. They cost more than Chameleon Skinks. Their combat stats are pretty terrible, and their range damage output is just not that high for the cost. They cost 675 gold. So while you can get a convenient attack here or there, you might be able to get the jump on a clumped up unit of Empire State Troops, I don't think it's necessarily worth it compared to, say, just Skinks with Javelins, who I think bring more utility and sort of more broader coverage to the field. with their ranged attacks. Not on par with other explosive type units either, like Miners with Blasting Charges, for example, or Vampire Coast Bombers. Just not quite in that league. And I think that kind of holds these guys back. They might have a bit of a niche as this backline harass unit. Definitely going to be better at interdicting backlines than, say, Chameleon Skinks are, just because their melee stats are, in fact, quite a bit more decent, especially defensively. You do get that extra physical resist, you do get extra HP, you do get extra melee defense, but I don't think this unit is going to be sort of superb. Maybe if they had a little more range, maybe they had a little more offensive stats, I'd say otherwise, but with such piddly weapon strength of 25, it's going to be hard for these guys, I think, to really net great value in a lot of situations. Moving on from there, we do have the two Cottles, the Beasts of the Skies, very impressive looking monsters, looking really, really cool. And obviously you've got a Regiment of Renown version as well as a vanilla version. The Spear of Teapot here is the Regiment of Renown. Vanilla version of the Cottle does have a cool aura here. It's called the Master of Sacred Places, gives all units underneath its stock. It also does have a Uran and Slenderbolt, bound spell, 2 of them, and a single Lesser Chain Lightning, which is a pretty solid selection of support abilities. It's got Fear, it's got Terror, it's got Magic Resist and Missile Resist, so all in all, a fairly tanky unit against missile play. Not so much in melee. In melee, its stats are definitely on the lower end, especially for its cost. Nothing to write home about. 400 weapon strength, not that amazing. Fairly low charge bonus for a flyer. Very low speed for a flyer at 80. I do believe that's even lower than a Manticore, which is obviously very low. Fairly low armor. Just definitely not a unit you want getting caught in melee. That said, can provide some great support. I think it's going to have some niche applications, just working with some Mimi Lizardmen build, or perhaps even just hovering over top of a Fire Slan. If you can, say, position a Fire Slan like off to the side of the aura for the stealth field. Like, let's say you position your Fire Slan here, and then you kind of creep up towards enemy cannons. You can pop that Fireball from relative safety, and then duck back into cover under the Coattle's stealth aura. Or you can even do that, perhaps even safer, with a Skink Oracle. That would be a pretty expensive combination. The Regiment of Renown Spirit of Teapot, I think, is a decent competitor with its vanilla variant. I'm not sure I'd say it's always a better choice, because the bound spells you get are Shield of Thorns and Banishment. Decent enough abilities, but not amazing, I would say. Certainly not sure they're worth a couple hundred more gold. Obviously, you do get better combat stats to boot because this is a Veteran C9 unit, but not sure this unit is, in fact, worth the extra funds that you're dropping into it. Especially because you basically just bring it for the Orbital Bombardment, and in that case, a normal Cottle is probably going to be adequate for just the Stealth Aura and the Orbital Bombardment. But I do think it's a fairly niche unit. I think in campaign it might have more usage just because you can drop cheap free banishments. You can bring a bunch of Coattles and like a Slan and just have an endless supply of banishments to just nuke enemy infantry formations and then clean up everything else in melee. But I do think in multiplayer it's going to be a very niche unit, though with some pretty fun combos, I think. And then we do have the Feral Triglodon as well as its cousin, the Pale Death, the Regiment of Renown. These two, basically the same unit. We already discussed them a good amount with the Skink Oracle. Literally, the Feral Triglodon is literally just a cheap Skink Oracle without Cold-Blooded, without Encourage, and with Rampage. Obviously, Rampage on Lizardmen is not too significant just because they've got Cold-Blooded on everybody and their grandmother. But a unit that can really apply hurt at long range. If you want some decent AP anti-large, this is a great unit to go about using it. And unlike, for example, the Razordons or Salamanders, who are great units in their own right, but are very vulnerable to Spirit Leech effects and magic damage and skirmishers and that sort of thing, the Triglodon is pretty much immune to such things. It's not going to get ripped apart by hounds. It's not going to get messed up by a handful of Spirit Leeches. Obviously, it does cost quite a lot more than those units, but it is much more self-sufficient. It's just as agile. It's dishes out a good amount of hurt, and it's a much more resilient in melee, plus much more of a performer in the late game. Once you're out of ammo, once you spent all 20 rounds in close quarters, this guy is, well, certainly not a top tier duelist for 1700 gold, more than adequate. And the Pale Death is even better than that in melee. That said, I'm not sure it's actually that great of a unit. The main benefit it has is Primeval Roar, which is an AoE plus 24 melee attack. The main thing is, I don't really think you want a Triglodon diving into melee early on in a fight. And the only way this ability recharges is in melee. So that kind of doesn't synergize with the Pale Death. This Regiment of Renown kind of feels like the White Wolves for the Empire or the Deathjacks for Empire. It's just Regiment Round that doesn't really have synergy with its perk. You might get this off once in a battle, and then maybe if you're lucky you'll get it off again later, but you don't really want your Triglodon, at least early on, fighting in a brawl. So this isn't going to recharge after the initial burst, and I don't think, obviously the melee stats are nice and leadership's nice, but I don't think it's worth dropping several hundred gold just to get a Primeval Roar single cast, essentially, on your Triglodon. Hate to say it, but like it could be a cool unit, but I just don't see it as being that valuable, unfortunately. In campaign, I do think Triglodons are pretty great. They do delete basically everything, infantry, large, and they're okay in melee, so there really is no target they're actually bad against. Not sure they're going to be up to snuff with other Lizardmen Doomstack options, just because Lizardmen Doomstacks are so varied and all of them are insane. They just have so many beasties to lean back on, but I definitely do think the Triglodon's going to be a great contender. And finally, we do have the Geltbloom's Terror, and this is the Regiment Renowned Feral Carnosaur with a pretty awesome looking skin. Among its perks is, of course, it's Relevancy rank 9, which is nice. But more importantly, you do get Vanguard, you don't get Rampage, and so that is a great combo. Just the ability to Vanguard a Carnosaur. Alongside, for example, the Pop Hopak cohort with the Sar Spears, plus, of course, the variety of Vanguard capable units that Lizardmen have. This guy, I think, is going to be a decent pick, at least with these niche sort of Lizardmen builds, because you can really cover your... you can really cover, say, a Skink Mob, or operate alongside Pterodon coverage, and really apply some pressure to enemy fast movers. If your opponent tries to bring heavy cav or whatever into the fray, the Geltbloom's Terror is going to kick their teeth in most of the time. And because obviously it's probably not going to beat a unit like, say, Kolek or whatever, but against most units it's going to be more than adequate, especially if you throw in the Pop Hopak cohort underneath it. Or maybe even just throw in some Chameleon Stalkers at its feet just to provide some support and saturation. And I think the Geltbloom's Terror is going to have its niche. That said, if you're doing a more compact, classic Lizard build, I do think it's not that valuable of a unit. Once again, Rampage is not super significant on Lizardmen just because everybody and their grandmother has Cold-Blooded, and Vanguard, of course, is kind of worthless if you're deploying normally just in your zone. So that's just my 2 cents there on Geltbloom's Terror. But all in all, a pretty interesting lineup of units. I do think most of them are functional but niche. I don't think any of these units are going to be sort of a meta pick for Lizardmen. I think the closest that we might see a lot of is a Skink Oracle, just because it does bring you healing without having to pay for without having to bring a Slan. So you can bring Krokgar, you can bring Takai, you can bring Tic-Tac-Toe, you can bring characters like that with a healer, which you cannot do otherwise. Otherwise you need a Ref Crystal. And that said, it is very expensive, and I think that is going to hamstring it a bit and make it more niche than most people might be anticipating. It's not like you can bring this as a butt-naked Skink for 400 gold. You do always have to cough up a minimum of 2150, which is a sixth of your army. That's no laughing matter, and I think it is going to hamstring the Skink Oracle when it comes to common play. And that is it for the Lizardmen. That is what we've got coming for us. Hopefully you guys did enjoy the video. As usual, leave your thoughts, opinions, comments, critiques down below. I'd love to hear what you all have to say about the upcoming units. And of course, do stay tuned for upcoming videos covering the Beastmen, as well as some of the other changes for Magic and other factions. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.